Hi, I'm Connor Deason, and welcome to 60 Minutes. American society is a mixing pot of generally well-adjusted individuals from a variety of societal and cultural backgrounds. However, every once in a while, the fabric of society is torn by a depraved individual whose sole driving force is to cause pain and suffering. These individuals feed off others' misfortune and despair, leaving a trail of heartbreak, pain, and fear. Tonight, we explore the personality of two of America's most notorious and infamous serial killers. Albert Fish, better known as the Brooklyn Vampire, gained pleasure through pain by abducting, torturing, and eating his victims. On the opposite side of the country, in Kansas, Dennis Rader, better known as the BTK Killer, struck fear in the hearts of residents of Wichita for more than 3 decades. His alias was an acronym for his favorite method of murder: bind them, torture them, kill them. On this episode, we will look at the factors that turn seemingly normal men into cold-blooded killers. If you passed him on the sidewalk, you would think he was simply a gentle old grandfather outside for a stroll. However, inside the mind of Albert Fish was a dangerous person with an endless sense of depravity. Born in 1870, Fish was the newest member in a family with a long-standing history of mental illness.
I was told that everyone in my family was screwed up in the head. My parents didn't care enough about me to take care of me. They just threw me away like I did the children I killed.
Fish was sent to an orphanage where he received regular beatings throughout his childhood. Personality psychologists attribute his parental abandonment and abuse in the orphanage to the eventual heinous crimes that Fish committed.
Psychoanalytic theorists hypothesize that childhood is crucial for the development of the ego and the superego. These two parts of the personality are incredibly important to a person's ability to align with societal norms and follow rules. For Fish, his basic id impulses ruled his actions, his desire towards aggression, sexual depravity, and antisocial behaviors. He had no other protective factors keeping him from impeding these basic animalistic instincts.
Animalistic might be the only word fitting enough to describe Fish's crimes.
I would convince the children to come with me. When I got them to my house, I would torture them, mutilate their genitalia, tie them up, and kill them. After my wife left, I decided I want to see what it'd be like to eat them. So I started doing that too. I preferred black kids and mental kids because nobody would miss them anyways. I was doing society a favor.
Fish was eventually caught when, after kidnapping, torturing, murdering, and eating 10-year-old Grace Budd, he sent an anonymous letter to the Budd family. Here he is, reading excerpts of his letter.
Dear Mrs. Budd, I call on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat in my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go. I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I would get her blood on them. When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run downstairs. I grabbed her and she said she would tell her mama. First I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though I could have had I wished. She died a virgin.
Despite his attorney's attempt to say that he was innocent by reason of insanity, Fish was found guilty and sentenced to death by electrocution.
Even the psychologist said I was crazy, but the jury didn't think so.
To drive home the depth of Fish's delusions, his last words as he was being hooked up to the electric chair that would end his life were, "I don't even know why I'm here." Personality psychologists explain this further through psychoanalytic theory.
Albert Fish is the epitome of what Freud talked about with his developmental stages. His abuse in the orphanage and abandonment by his parents left him stagnant in development. This stagnation prevented him from ever developing past his id, the pleasure principle of our brains. His lack of ego is responsible for his sexual and aggressive behavior. His lack of superego resulted in his lack of conscience.
While Albert Fish preyed upon minorities in early 1900s New York, the peaceful town of Wichita, Kansas faced its own serial killer throughout the 1970s. The self-named BTK killer would shake the town to its core, leaving everyone searching for ways to guarantee their safety from the madman on the loose.
I suggested the name BTK because that's what I did to them. I bound them, tortured them, and killed them. California feared the Zodiac Killer, London feared Jack the Ripper, but I wanted everyone to fear BTK.
BTK first struck on January 15, 1974, when he murdered the Otero family after a failed attempt at acting out his sexual fantasies on Mother Julie Otero and her 11-year-old daughter, Josephine. Two of the male members of the family were found tied up with bags over their heads, suffocating them. Julie Otero was found bound and strangled on her bed, while Josephine was found hanging from a pipe in the basement with only a sweatshirt and socks on.
From then on, I couldn't stop. I loved to stalk my victims. I loved the power I had knowing that they would come home, find me in their bedrooms, and that I could control whether they lived or died. I loved watching them all look at me as I strangled the life out of them. I loved the power I got knowing that, despite being able to taunt the police by communicating with them about the crimes, they couldn't figure out who I was.
The killer was right. In fact, the identity of the BTK killer would remain unknown for 3 decades until 2004. The taunting communication from BTK with the police would ultimately lead to his arrest when police were able to trace a floppy disk sent by the killer to a user by the name of Dennis at a Lutheran church within the community. After doing further research, including obtaining a warrant for a DNA sample from a close relative to the killer, the police were finally able to arrest Dennis Rader, a church deacon. This stunning revelation caused many to wonder how such a sadistic killer could have remained within their midst for so long.
When looking at a serial killer's personality, we often think that mental illness has a large role in their crimes. However, in the case of Dennis Rader, personality psychologists would look more towards the trait aspects of his personality.
My childhood was fine. My first experience with death was in my early teenage years when I strangled a bird. From then on, I couldn't get enough of it. I had an innate urge to strangle more birds, cats, dogs, anything I could get away with. Eventually, I couldn't satisfy myself with just animals. I had to move to humans.
Psychologist Hans Eisnick would argue that Rader's traits were derived from one of his big 3 biological systems, psychoticism. Those who identified with this trait would show traits like aggressiveness, coldness, egocentrism, impulsivity, and antisocial behaviors. Through interviews with Rader, we have seen all of these traits manifest themselves. R.B. Cattell might call these Rader's source traits, which are responsible for the ultimate surface manifestations of his personality.
Ultimately, it is impossible to explain what exactly turns a person into a serial killer, and it would, in fact, be foolish to believe that one factor results in such level of disregard for human life. However, it is certain that personality has a large driving factor in these behaviors. Through the various theories of personality, experts are able to better understand the actions of these depraved individuals in an attempt to ultimately be able to better predict who may be responsible for these actions. This will, hopefully, one day, result in a greater ability to not only understand these individuals, but find and capture them before they are allowed to prey upon even greater members of society. For 60 Minutes, I'm Connor Deason.